studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Tuesday, June 2nd, 2015. As three key provisions of the Patriot Act expire, we'll turn to retired NSA officer Kirk Wiebe to find out if the USA Freedom Act is any consolation. And Frederick A. Schwarz discusses his new book, Democracy in the Dark, The Seduction of Government Secrecy. Mr. Schwarz was the lead counsel to the Church Committee 40 years ago, and he's calling for a new such committee now. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hi, Sonali.
Hundreds of people are missing and feared dead after a boat sank in China's Yangtze River last night. The boat was carrying more than 450 people. 5 have been confirmed dead so far, but that number is very likely going to rise. The boat was apparently caught in a cyclone, and Chinese media reported that there were winds of 40 miles per hour. Hundreds of rescue workers have been deployed, but ongoing fog and rain has hampered efforts. Meanwhile, in Bonn, Germany, climate representatives from a number of countries are meeting this week to edit an agreement to curb greenhouse gas emissions in preparation for this December's UN talks in Paris. French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius made waves when he stated that any plan agreed upon should not hinge on approval by the U.S. Congress. He said, quote, "We know the politics in the U.S., whether we like it or not. If it comes to the Congress, they will refuse." Well, Bob, first, should we consider China's boat disaster a byproduct of our changing climate? And second, should we be ashamed as Americans at the French Foreign Minister's quite realistic statements?
Yeah, well, of course, any weather event is connected to the larger climate system. And we repeat over and over again, climate change doesn't mean we can predict these kinds of events. It means that these events will be more intense and more unpredictable, and this is just another example of that. What is predictable, of course, is the insanity of the U.S. Congress, and the French official is quite correct that climate change denial is now so deeply connected to ideology, both free market ideology and the particular Republican Party ideology, that we can assume no rational behavior on the part of Congress on anything related to climate change right now.
And a new investigative report by AP has unearthed a bombshell about government surveillance. The news organization has found that, quote, the FBI is operating a small air force with scores of low-flying planes across the country carrying video and, at times, cell phones surveillance technology, all hidden behind fictitious companies that are fronts for the government. For years, reports of suspicious-looking planes flying over neighborhoods fueled fears of government surveillance, including during recent protests in Baltimore, Maryland, after the police custody death of Freddie Gray. This new report confirms those fears. The FBI is apparently cooperating with local police departments to share information. The report was released as a debate rages in Congress over provisions of the USA Patriot Act and the right of the government to spy on Americans. Bob, this report sounded like Orwellian-inspired fiction to me. What do you make of it?
Well, it's extremely disturbing for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, the technology. As more technological advances are made in the ability to surveil and control people, we should assume that law enforcement and military will use it. There's no reason not to, and that's disturbing, of course. The cooperation between federal officials, state and local officials is also disturbing. It's one thing for the FBI, the political police of the country, to do this. We've known this is going on for a long time. It's more disturbing, I think, when it infiltrates down to the local level. What was most striking about this story is that the FBI is using these shell companies, and when it asked the Associated Press not to reveal the names of those companies, one of the reasons it said is because if you do, we'll just have to set up new ones. The brazen quality of this was really striking. This was a frightening story, no doubt.
And later in our program, we will be covering more of the debate over the Patriot Act, as well as speaking with Frederick A. Schwarz about his book, Democracy in the Dark. And finally, 3 new election-related polls were released today. A Washington Post/ABC News poll has found that the 2016 field of GOP presidential candidates is so crowded that no clear frontrunner has emerged, and that the presumptive Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton suffers from a problem of, quote, trustworthiness. A CNN ORC survey found similar results for Clinton, with 50% of those polled saying that she does not inspire confidence. And a New York Times CBS poll examining arguably the most important election-related issue of campaign finance found that regardless of party affiliation, ordinary people overwhelmingly reject the Supreme Court's notion that money is speech. There is strong public support to overturn the court's disastrous Citizens United decision that has enabled billionaires to have unprecedented influence over elections. Sadly, there is little faith that elected officials who are beholden to the system will work to change it. Bob, as a journalism professor, what do you take away from these 3 polls just released today?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that campaign finance reform is always important and, in a sense, always a failed project. As we pass one set of measures, we found in the past that concentrated wealth finds its way around those. So campaign finance reform laws themselves are not the issue, I think. They're a good thing to pursue, but they aren't going to solve the problem, because the problem is concentrated wealth. If wealth were distributed around the country fairly equally, then money in politics wouldn't be a problem. I think it's always important to tie campaign finance abuses with the inherent abuse in democracy that comes with concentrated wealth. That's the problem, and that's where we need to keep our focus.
Robert Jensen, thank you so much for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. This is Uprising, and by the way, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Your subscription not only sustains the TV production of Uprising, but it also enables you exclusive access to all our videos online without any fundraising pitches. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Privacy advocates celebrated a small victory this weekend after 3 key provisions of the USA Patriot Act expired before Congress could renew them. These provisions included Section 215, which the National Security Agency used as legal justification for sweeping up the phone and business records of the public, and it included what are colloquially referred to as the lone wolf provision and the roving wiretap provision. In the lead-up to the Sunday expiration of these provisions, lawmakers debated several bills, one of which passed to the House, called the USA Freedom Act. That bill failed to pass a procedural vote at the Senate, but now Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has promised to revive it in the Senate for a vote as early as today or tomorrow. Activist groups like Fight for the Future signed on to a statement saying, quote, "The USA Freedom Act is a mass surveillance bill dressed up as a reform bill, and its passage will authorize unconstitutional surveillance practices." But others, like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, are neutral on the bill. The political drama played out on Capitol Hill 2 years after whistleblower Edward Snowden alerted the public to the once secret program of surveillance. The Justice Department will likely help to craft a legal justification for the temporary lapse in legal authority to spy. We turn now to Kirk Wiebe. He is a former National Security Agency whistleblower who worked at the agency for 36 years before he retired in 2001, and along with fellow NSA whistleblower William Binney, he made several key public disclosures regarding the NSA's massive surveillance program. Welcome to Uprising, Kirk.
It's good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Now, what happened to, before we get into the provisions that expired and the USA Freedom Act, which is likely to replace those expired provisions, what happened to the compromise bills that were presented as alternatives by Senators Dianne Feinstein and Richard Burr? Feinstein's bill was particularly problematic in that it seemed to enshrine penalties for whistleblowers that are modeled in the Espionage Act. Are those 2 bills dead?
Nothing's ever dead. Just other chapters. We'll have to see how this whole thing evolves. But the Feinstein bill was particularly pointy, as you note, against whistleblowing. And it's not the first time that's happened. It seems that people who are destined to leave the Senate are the ones given the task of presenting the more controversial and what I would call mean-spirited or nasty legislation designed to squelch free speech in the United States. The last time it happened, I believe it was Senator Kyle of Arizona who offered legislation, and it almost passed, to give authority to intelligence agency heads, directors of those agencies, the power to deny even retired intelligence workers their government pensions. And they would be able to do that with their own power, just as a single person. It wouldn't have to go through any review body or anything. So we seem a bit, excuse my language, hell-bent on creating a police state with sovereign powers in the branches of government, especially Congress and the executive branches, that really subvert our form of judicial review and due process under the Constitution. It's a dangerous trend, even though it didn't pass.
Now, let's talk about the USA Freedom Act. The Obama administration released a statement yesterday in support of that bill, and it's called, this is what the Obama administration said, it called the bill a reasonable compromise, balancing security and privacy, allowing us to continue to protect the country while implementing various reforms, including prohibiting bulk collection through the use of Section 215, FISA, pen registers, and national security letters. What do you make of the statement, and what is your position on the USA Freedom Act? Is it supposedly reasonable and a compromise?
The president's wrong, with all due respect. The president is playing a political game, as is the Congress. People in power cherish the tools that give them insight into populations. And this one, the U.S. intelligence apparatus, has been turned against the American people. In my view, as a move that subverts our rights under the Constitution. So we have anti-constitutional behavior. We have window dressing in the form of the USA Freedom Act. It is window dressing at best. It really does nothing to stop bulk collection, because even though they may not be able to do it under Section 215, they can do it under other authorities that NSA already has, such as Executive Order 12333. That's EO12333. And Section 2.3C for those who are into detail.
So then why are they pushing so hard for these if they already have the authority in other ways, in other places?
Because they are worried about their jobs. They feel the American people are starting to wake up. You know, the American people is the sleeping giant. And most of us, most people don't pay attention to this kind of stuff the way you and I do. And so we're a minority. But the population, as this gets spread around through the media and becomes known, is beginning to wake up. And this, to me, is a sign that Congress is starting to get a little uncomfortable in their chairs. And even though they do a rotten job of oversight, I would say no oversight, they do have to play the game and make it look like they're doing something. So this is a pill they are going to swallow publicly, claim it is a reasonable compromise, but it does virtually nothing.
So let's talk about the public, since you brought that up. There was a CNN ORC poll that was released just yesterday that said that 61% of Americans actually approve of renewing the Patriot Act's provisions that expired. However, just a few months ago, a Pew Research Center survey showed that 2/3 of Americans believe that there aren't adequate limits on the kinds of phone and internet data the government can collect. So these results seem to contradict one another. And what is apparently going on is, of course, how polls protesters ask the questions. So it seems as though the public is just very easily swayed and confused because this is an extremely confusing topic and you can get lost in the forest of metadata and bulk collection, etc.
I feel for the public having to listen to this jargon. The names of the legislation, they're designed to elicit emotion. Words like Patriot Act, and Freedom Act. It's all psychological manipulation. And I hate to sound like a conspiracy theorist. I'm not. I'm simply stating those in power cherish it. They have a powerful apparatus. They don't want anybody messing with it. They haven't solved a terrorist case recently. What happened to Boston? What happened to Charlie Hebdo? And Hebdo was foreign. And that's the job of the NSA. Foreign intelligence. Didn't do a thing to stop it. Probably didn't even know it was going to happen. We have a broken intelligence process. Not only does Congress not do oversight properly, and most of them don't know what they're doing, I dare say, because of all this confusion that you mentioned, but the NSA isn't doing its job very well. It's building this huge haystack and it can't find the needles, and it keeps making the haystack bigger, and so it fails to find these events. NSA's job is not to understand how something happened after the fact. Its job is to prevent disaster, prevent carnage, prevent harm to people and property.
Kirk, what about the fact that in early May, a federal appeals court declared the NSA surveillance unconstitutional? How does the existing congressional debate fit within the fact that the court system itself is dealing with the legality of this and has ruled, at least in this one instance and probably in other instances, that it's not constitutional to invade Americans' privacy in such a massive way where we're simply vacuuming up people's information just in case?
Well, it's an encouraging sign. And as you point out, there have been a few other cases that have ruled against this kind of broad surveillance, which all violates the Fourth Amendment requirement of particularity versus general searches. When they go after bulk collection on all of us, they're not suspicious of any one or two people. They're suspicious of all of us. And that violates the requirement of particularity under the Constitution. And some judges are brave enough to remember their law school and their teachings about the Constitution and to honor it. And I'm very troubled, by the way, that the only senator I see upholding their oath of office to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, is Rand Paul.
Yeah.
There's a few others, I think, that have said they're in line with Rand Paul, but they need to come out more vocally on that.
Right. It's quite shameful that there is only one, happens to be a Republican. Let's talk about the fact that there are people like yourself and many others around the country and the world who are using creative ways to educate the public about the dangers of mass surveillance. There is currently a tour around the world with colleagues of yours and mine. People like Daniel Ellsberg, Norman Solomon, and Colleen Rowley are in Europe for a tour called Stand Up for the Truth. You are part of this tour here in the United States, as are several others. Can you tell us a little bit about how journalists and whistleblowers and activists are joining hands on this tour to raise consciousness?
Yes. We got together, I guess it was last year, with Norman Solomon, who's been leading very effectively this effort. What you see now is this tour in European capitals. I believe they're going to Oslo, Berlin, Stockholm, and there's one other.
London as well. Yeah.
Yes, London as well. To raise the consciousness of what's going on here. We tend to parse the news world into compartments. We have government, politics, security, all of these areas. We need to back off and say, why is there such crime in our big cities? Why is the government working against the people? Why are these larger tectonic plates moving in the way they are? It's because of corruption. All of it, the only common thread is corruption. And corruption occurs, we discussed this at length, from the lowest levels of an organization where someone pilfers cash from the coffee fund, or maybe buys something for the company but pockets part of the expense because they got it cheaper than what they said they could get it, all the way up to the top of the highest levels of the US government, where news media are so kind to corruption by calling it politics. We've got to separate what these things truly are. When there's deceit and lying and misappropriation or misuse of funds, when there's dishonesty and secrets kept from the American people, to the point where the government and the nation cannot function well, look at where we are. We are at least $19 trillion in debt, and we're continuing to spend money like someone's giving it to us from the heavens.
And speaking of that, Kirk, you might have seen the report this morning by the AP about the FBI running a small air force with small planes around cities, collecting information with video and cell phone surveillance, and using fictitious companies as front groups for the government, all of which, of course, costs money, as you were just saying. And when the AP did this report and approached the FBI, the government basically said, please don't expose the names of these companies. If you do, we'll simply have to make new companies. And this confirms the suspicions of people who were, for example, on the streets of Baltimore only a few months ago, protesting the death of Freddie Gray and noticing these planes flying overhead.
Yes. We are truly witnessing, and I mean it in the most serious sense, the ascension of the police state. Some people call it fascism. We've seen it in history. I worry that we don't teach history in our schools the way we should be. Kids should be coming out of schools knowing the lessons of that we derive from World War II and what kind of government behaved this way under Adolf Hitler, and the secret police merging with the intelligence. That's exactly what we've seen under the Patriot Act. It tore down the walls between the FBI and the NSA. So we now have the Department of Homeland Security growing a force of its own type of security people. We have the FBI, as you point out. We have the NSA. We have a variety of organizations that constitute a huge intelligence police apparatus, and it's being turned against the American people under the explanation that we need to protect you. My goodness, that is the excuse used by every tyrannical government in history. It's for the benefit of the people. I would argue otherwise, and we've got to stop this in its tracks.
And it's quite hypocritical of many of our lawmakers. For example, just taking Senator Dianne Feinstein for a minute, who last year was outraged that the CIA was spying on her when she, as the member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, was investigating Bush-era torture tactics, but then herself, of course, has no problem exposing Americans to the same treatment that she was upset about being subject to.
And that's an excellent example of the hypocrisy. And you could talk about Mitch McConnell. You know, I used to think there was a difference between liberals and conservatives, or I should say Democrats and Republicans, but there isn't. Ultimately, they're all in it.
At least on this issue, yeah.
Yes, they're all in it for their own skin. And I used to be a Republican my whole life, and I actually changed my affiliation to independent. I'm sick of it. We have to change things.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering if you, Kirk, can tell us your own story. You worked at the NSA for 36 years before you retired and spoke out about it alongside your colleagues like William Binney. In what capacity, first of all, did you work at the NSA for all those decades? And what was it that finally made you realize you just didn't want to be part of this anymore?
Sure. To compact the story, because 32
Sure.
years is a lot of stuff, but I actually was hired by NSA for my degree, my master's degree in the Russian language. I entered the NSA at a time when the Cold War was well underway, and the Soviet Union was the target, and the concern because it had nuclear weapons that were pointed at the United States. And so we needed to monitor the intentions and provide warning if and when necessary. We called it intentions and warning. And that was true of any country that was destined to or intended to do harm to the United States, INW. NSA's job is to warn and stop catastrophe, not pick up the pieces afterwards. That's the FBI's job. In any case, I was a Russian linguist. I then became an intelligence analyst. And then from there, I actually worked in the personnel effort, hiring bright young analysts and making trips to various universities. And that got me a promotion, by the way. And then I went on to work in the information technology arena, and went into policy arena, the higher staff in support of the management, the higher management in the agency. And in the course of all that, I was awarded the second highest award that NSA bestows, called the Meritorious Civilian Service Award. So I took the job seriously. I worked hard. I enjoyed the work. But there came a day when that all changed. And that's when I had sought to work with Bill Binney, Ed Loomis, and a handful of programmers and computer scientists in a research organization. We were very small, but that group was working on the most pressing issues of variety, velocity, and volume of digital communications that were exploding globally. And NSA was behind. NSA, you know, the internet was really something that developed so quickly because of technology and the people of the world's desire to connect with one another. And so it really wasn't built by the government. It may have been invented by the government. But the internet was built by people and a lot of volunteers and sweat and hard work. And along with that, great usage of it. And then all the different ways you could use it. First, it was just sending files. Then it became talking via chat, and then it was phones going over the internet, and then it was your smartphone. So now you had a baby computer in your hand, and you could look at your email and do the texting and chatting and all of that, and go to Facebook and post. Well, you know the story. So NSA had to learn how to deal with all of that. How can you monitor foreign threats if you can't sort through all this, and if you can't handle the volume, if you can't handle the variety, the different kinds, etc. So these guys were making huge breakthroughs. The deputy director of NSA came down, saw what they were doing, and said, "My God, you guys have made huge breakthroughs. Why are you being quiet?" We weren't being quiet. We were being oppressed by other people within the agency who had their own ideas about this, but hadn't had the success, and they were jealous. Well, along comes Michael Hayden, decides to launch something called Trailblazer. Michael Hayden didn't do his homework inside NSA, did not pick Bill Binney's brains or any of the brains that were working with us in that little research organization. And their project failed within 4 years, and the agency has been left with who knows what to pick up the pieces of a failure. And yet Hayden got promoted, goes all the way to Central Intelligence Agency Director and Deputy Director of National Intelligence, and now makes a 6 or 7 figure income.
We have a few seconds left, Kirk. So you left the agency and were moved by your conscience.
Yes, yeah. In 2001, Halloween Day, Bill Binney, Kirk Wiebe, and Ed Loomis walked out the door.
Wow.
And we thought we were going to bring our ideas, which did work and did them constitutionally, to another part of the government, but we were denied that. We were shut out and blackballed.
Well, I want to thank you so much for sharing your story with us and your reflections on this issue, and really appreciate everything you've done. Thanks.
My pleasure. Nice talking with you.
My guest, Kirk Wiebe, is a former National Security Agency whistleblower who worked at the NSA for 36 years before retiring in 2001 and joining fellow whistleblower William Binney. You can find out more about the tour we were talking about earlier at standupfortruth.org. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Takes place on a daily basis is not at all a new phenomenon in the United States. The post-9/11 world of collect it all is different from previous eras, mostly in the available technology and the reach of spy agencies to watch our every move. 40 years ago, the Church Committee, named after Idaho Senator Frank Church, set out to investigate the extent of the government's spying activities at that time. Out of the work by the 11-member group came the establishment of congressional intelligence committees and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, under which secret courts were established to oversee spying programs. But today, neither has been a very reliable check on government. Joining me in studio today is Frederick A. Schwarz. He was the chief counsel for the Church Committee 40 years ago. He has a new book out called Democracy in the Dark, the Seduction of Government Secrecy, and he thinks we need a new church committee. Welcome to Uprising, Fritz.
I'm glad to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, you write that too much is kept secret to not to protect America, but to keep embarrassing or illegal conduct from Americans, and that is part of the fear that we have of government secrecy today, that government officials claim everything must be kept secret in the interest of national security. But it turns out when people start peeling back the layers, when there are whistleblowers, that some of that information, or a big part of it, is just kept there because they want to have it for some reason in the future, or because sometimes it's just too embarrassing.
Yeah, they stop thinking. That's one of the most dangers of the seduction of secrecy, that once something's stamped secret, people just stop thinking. For example, the 9/11 warnings that the White House got were stamped top secret legitimately, but when they had so many as they did, they should have revealed it to the public, and we might have well have prevented 9/11, but people just stop thinking when something is stamped as secret.
So how does today's current surveillance state and system compare to what we had in the country in the 70s, or leading up to the 70s and through the 70s?
Well, as you say, the technology is different. The technology is far more powerful. Senator Church went on television during the middle of our hearings and said we are at risk of being totally overcome by the surveillance, but that surveillance then was in the Stone Age as compared to today. It's much broader, much more dangerous. Although the technology also is one of the seeds for why I'm optimistic that over the next years we're going to get change, because people in the most intelligent people in the intelligence agencies are saying we've got too much, and having too much gets in the way of the speed of distributing things, so we should cut down on secrecy.
So tell us a little bit about the Church Committee itself. People sort of forget about this today. What was the political context of the time, and how much of it was a result of journalism, was exposing that we were being surveilled?
Journalism is extremely important, was then, still is. The context of the time was we'd had the Vietnam War. Americans were upset about what they thought the government was doing. We
just passed the official end of the anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War.
Right, and that was happening at the same time.
Yeah.
Watergate had happened. That made people worry about government overreaching. And so the Church Committee was established. Now, many people thought what we would do is just find more bad stuff that Richard Nixon had done. And I think our most powerful finding was that every president from Franklin Roosevelt through Richard Nixon, 4 Democrats and 2 Republicans, had overplayed their power. Now, some of the things that we found out, just to tick off 3 quickly, one was that the FBI tried to destroy Martin Luther King by actually trying to get him to commit suicide. The CIA hired the mafia, actually hired the mafia to help them try to kill Fidel Castro. And the National Security Agency, or NSA as we know it mostly, tried to get copies of every telegram that left the United States. But today, the problems are worse because of the increasing strength of the technology.
So it was only an 11-member committee. How did you, working with them, get access to the information? I mean, you must have had to have the CIA comply with you, which couldn't have been an easy task.
Or the FBI.
Or the FBI, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, who knows whether they ever gave us everything they should have, but we got an enormous amount. We got more information about the secret government than ever has happened in the United States or ever has happened in the world. 2 factors helped us, 2 human factors. One, J. Edgar Hoover was dead. He was so scary to people that had he still been alive, could we have gotten all the information about the FBI that we did? That's an open question. Second thing is that Gerald Ford had become president. He was the first person to become president who hadn't even been elected to be vice president. And he was very vulnerable to an accusation that he was not cooperating with us, because Nixon, after all, had fallen because he tried to abuse his secret powers and use the CIA to stop the FBI. So Ford was a little bit weak and had to be willing to cooperate with us. And so those reasons, plus a lot of pressure from us, were why we got as much information as we did.
And speaking of J. Edgar Hoover, in your book you claim that he and Dick Cheney reshaped American government and American life, and you single these 2 men out. Hoover might be dead, but Cheney's still around. Why do these 2 men stand out so much?
Well, because they had such power, and they both, at the height of their power, abused secrecy. Cheney's an interesting story, though, in the book. What I point out is that he, in his earlier days, first had said presidential meetings. He was chief of staff for President Gerald Ford, and he had said presidential meetings, the ones held in the White House, not public, but the president must hear all sides. And of course, when he becomes vice president, his technique with George W. Bush was basically George W. Bush should hear only me, not all sides. The other, even more interesting one, is something I discovered in writing this book that had never been exposed before, that when Cheney was in Congress, he was a congressman from Wyoming, and he was the leading Republican on the so-called Iran-Contra investigation that investigated what Ronald Reagan had done in Iran to sell them weapons and to give money to the Contras in Nicaragua. But Cheney, in his long dissent from the majority opinion, wrote that a wise government, a wise White House, will not rely on excessive secrecy and will engage in something that he called democratic persuasion, which he defined as not doing something hard and important in foreign policy or national security area without having a full airing to the public.
Right.
And yet again, of course, when he was vice president, that was the farthest from the policy of the Bush administration.
Why is secrecy so seductive, to paraphrase your subtitle? I mean, we supposedly live in democracies. The whole idea is that we need to have checks and balances on these sorts of abuses of power. And if we don't, what sets us apart from a dictatorship?
Well, the key to democracy is the public getting information. And the key to that is journalism and the government itself behaving properly. But on the seduction of secrecy, it seduces both the writer and the listener. The writer, I'll give an example on each side. In the writer's case, right now, each year, 100 million new documents are stamped secret. That's a staggering amount. So if you want to have anybody read your memo, you better try to classify it as top secret, and even there are classifications even beyond top secret, because otherwise nobody's going to read it.
Right.
So in that sense, secrecy spawns more secrecy. Then in terms of the seduction to the listener is, first place, a lot of readers assume secrecy is the same thing as true. Secret is the same thing as true. And they decline to pay attention to things that aren't secret. For example, the CIA, which has been told to have a whole institute on what's called, which is on non-secret intelligence, is slow to do it. And way back in World War II, when we had made heroic efforts and great successes in breaking the Nazis' code, unfortunately, sometimes people who had access to that information didn't bother to look at other information. And so while it was wonderful, the seduction of the highly secret made you fail to look at things that aren't secret.
And so a big part of what came out from 9/11 was government agencies needing to share information. But some people thought that even civil libertarians were worried about the sharing of information.
Well, but the you can walk and chew gum, I think, and they were correct. The 9/11 Commission was correct that the CIA didn't tell the FBI some information that could have led to arresting a couple of the hijackers, and then that might have unrolled the whole plot. So they were right that the government agencies themselves should share. There are limits on everything. You know, you don't want to share, like J. Edgar Hoover did, all the dirt on people. And my point that I think an even more fundamental failure leading to 9/11 was that the White House didn't even think about releasing the very, very scary warnings it got, and it got a lot of them from the CIA, and just let those out to the public. And I lay out in the book why I think that very likely would have prevented 9/11. But it wasn't because they were bad people in this respect. It was because they just didn't think.
My guest is Fritz Schwarz, whose book, Democracy in the Dark, The Seduction of Government Secrecy, lays out the case for, among other things, why we might need a new church committee. Let's talk about that. What could a similar committee to the one that you participated in 40 years ago, what would you like to see it be comprised of, or who I should say, and what would it do?
Well, the first thing is it has to approach its job from a nonpartisan point of view, and
which these days is a tall order.
But we did that in the church committee. We had 6 Democrats and 5 Republicans. The vice chair was a Republican. It's a different system, and it would normally have been 7 Democrats and 4, but the powers that be made it 6 and 5. And as I say, I think our most important finding was that presidents of both parties had abused their powers. So the first thing a new committee should do is be nonpartisan. That's easier to do now than it was. I started calling for a new church committee back in 07 or 08. And then one drawback would have been it only could have focused post 9/11 on the one administration, the George W. Bush administration. Today, a new church committee could focus on both a Republican and a Democratic, the Obama administration, and that, I think, helps it be nonpartisan. Then, assuming it's nonpartisan, it has to be rigorous. You have to get the information. But you also have to recognize that there are some legitimate secrets. There was at the same time as the church committee, which was in the Senate, there was a House committee, and it could have done enormously good work because it was focusing less on misbehavior, which in a way was what the Church Committee mainly did, and more on the quality of the work that was coming out of the intelligence community. But it was generally a failure because it did not recognize the legitimacy of some secrecy. So you have to start with the view that yes, there's too much, and yes, it lasts for too long, but you must recognize some secrecy is legitimate.
Can you give us a historical example of what might be, should have been a legitimate secret?
Well, I'll give you an example and then give an exception to it.
Okay.
A legitimate secret would be a weakness in your own military. And we can go way back to George Washington on that. George Washington concealed from the British and actually put out false information about the amount of ammunition, gunpowder, and weapons that he had as he sat in the hills outside Boston and the British sat in the city of Boston. And if the truth had been known, the British might well have been able to push Washington away and defeat his army very early in the war. Perfect example of legitimately keeping secret a military weakness. Now let's go up to the Iraq War. And you remember the situation where the IEDs, improvised explosive devices, were blowing up under American vehicles and blowing up the vehicle, the bottom of the vehicle, and blowing up the bottoms of the men and women that were sitting in the vehicle. Terrible results for those poor people who were hit by these devices. Now, it turned out, and this comes out in Robert Gates's recent autobiography, that a leak about the problem and how slow the military was in solving it, I think it was a leak to USA Today, and Robert Gates, Secretary of Defense, read about that leak, and he said, get going, fix this problem, fix it faster. So it was an example of where actually a leak about what was a military weakness, but nonetheless was helpful. So it's, right. I could give similar examples for every instance of legitimate secrecy and say, here's why it's generally legitimate, and here's an exception that limits your belief that it's legitimate.
On the church committee and the idea to have a new church committee, I mean, one would imagine that a long-term fix to abuse of state powers on surveillance and other things is what's most desired. And perhaps the church committee 40 years ago thought they were doing that with the establishment of the intelligence committees in the in houses of Congress, and also the creation of the FISA courts. But today, we have intelligence committees either not being given enough information, being spied on themselves, as we saw the Senate Intelligence Committee last year.
On the torture
report.
The
torture report about the CIA, and the FISA courts literally being part of the problem and putting a stamp of approval on surveillance.
Yeah.
I'm sure 40 years ago you didn't expect that.
We did not, and actually I know that Fritz Mondale, who was very involved, Senator Mondale and then Vice President Mondale, very involved in the FISA court, is writing something about how it has changed and how that, and I write something in the book about that also, in Democracy in the Dark. Well, if you can get 35 years of improvement, that's good. It's not good enough. You have to be eternally vigilant. Yeah. What did Jefferson say? Eternal vigilance is the something of liberty, you know.
And so then what, I mean, perhaps they're only going through a process can make apparent what solutions we can come up with. But a new church committee, what could a new church committee do? President Obama has appointed his own task force for what to do about or to, investigate the NSA. But this is like asking it's like asking the police to police themselves.
Yeah, well, no, not really, because the Senate can be critical of the Senate, and although that's not done, but too much. But we were critical of how the Congress had done beforehand.
Right.
And FISA. One of the problems with FISA is it's now doing things that no court should do. The legitimate reason for the FISA court was to look at individual demands for information, warrantless wiretapping of a suspect. In the same way as in regular criminal cases, a magistrate in secret grants a warrant. Where FISA went wrong was when the government persuaded it to act not as a court deciding a narrow matter, but as in effect, a legislature, and it isn't a legislature, it's a court. Now, the new church committee will come. It doesn't have to come tomorrow, but it will come, and when it comes, we will learn facts that are worse than we thought we knew. We will learn more things. There are things we don't yet know. And that's what drives, one of the things that drives reform is people getting bothered by what they learn.
Didn't the 9/11 Commission do some of what one might have expected a sort of church committee to do?
I think it was narrower. In general, I think it did an extremely good job. And they were very nonpartisan, too. That was another one of their best. And the way they sat, they didn't sit Democrats in the left and Republicans on the right. They sat mixed up. The only thing I criticize them for is that they didn't say, well, the White House should have revealed, not exposed, the warnings that it had gotten. But they weren't designed to be a general review of the intelligence community. They were designed to look at one terrible specific event.
And also, of course, what came out of the church committee that I'm guessing what you really want to happen is a perhaps greater transformation of our government system to put at greater checks and balances. I want to turn to the Obama administration. And as you said, any new committee that's formed can impartially look at the last two administrations, one Democratic and one Republican, to see, perhaps equal amounts of abuses of power. The Obama administration is interesting in that it boasts that it's the most transparent administration in U.S. history. We, of course, know that it's one of the most secretive, but we shouldn't be surprised by that claim, right?
Well, I think as a generality, it's very common for people before they're elected to bow toward openness, and then after they are elected to bend toward secrecy. That's quite common. Obama is an interesting mixed story. I mean, he has done things that were more open. And when he started, he revealed the torture memos that had been kept secret, and that was an important step. But on a more structural basis, he has improved the transparency. He's improved the extent to which the intelligence agency's budgets are made known. It still has to be better, but he's improved it. He issued a lot of information on our nuclear capacity that was previously secret. Where he's been, I think, least good, most secretive, is in supporting the Justice Department's efforts to close down cases, for example, on torture, where some person found already to be innocent, not Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, but someone who was tortured and has been found to be innocent, and then brought a lawsuit against the United States for torture, and the Justice Department has uniformly succeeded in using something called the state secrets doctrine to get those cases dismissed. And another area in which the Obama administration has gone beyond its predecessors in secrecy is in threatening journalists and in some cases prosecuting whistleblowers.
Yes, absolutely, and actively going after journalists like James Rise, in a story we've been covering quite a lot on our program. And on the issue of journalism, 40 years ago was the work of people like Seymour Hersh that revealed the CIA's dirty deeds. Today we have folks like Glenn Greenwald, James Rise, and others.
Snowden also.
And of course Edward Snowden, absolutely. You earlier in our conversation talked about how technology technology has not just increased the reach of surveillance, but it could also actually be a tool to curb surveillance. Is that because of the ease of being able to leak information these days?
Well, that is one reason that when someone leaks now, I mean, it took Ellsberg,
Daniel Ellsberg,
Daniel Ellsberg for Pentagon Papers, which were I think a total of 7,000 pages, about 4 months to photocopy them.
Yeah.
Now someone like Manning or Snowden can you just snap the finger, and they have 1,000, 1,000,000 times as much volume. Now I lost your question, though.
And so can technology actually help us curb surveillance?
Technology can, because, as you say, leaks can be bigger, and I think most importantly, because the smart people in the agencies, and I developed this in the conclusion of my book, particularly talking about a book by a man called Joel Brenner, who'd been a high-ranking intelligence official, and who takes the position that the coin of the realm today in protecting the nation is speed of getting information to the right person. And when you have these enormous mountains of documents that are secret, he says, well, that inevitably makes it harder to act quickly. And the country should get over the idea that it's going to protect all this information, which, as you say, either through leaks or because there are other ways in which it's discovered, is going to come out anyway. We should get over that, and we should no longer rely on secrecy to protect ourselves to the same extent.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and shedding some light on this information. And maybe in the next few years, we'll see if we do get a new church committee. Thank you so much.
Well, we're going to get it sometime, and we're going to get reform sometime. And I hope my book, Democracy in the Dark, moves the debate along.
I've been speaking with Frederick A. Schwarz. He was the chief counsel for the Church Committee 40 years ago. And this was the committee named after Idaho Senator Frank Church, who set out to investigate the extent of the government's spying activities at that time. And out of that 11-member group came the establishment of congressional intelligence committees and even the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and under which secret courts were established to oversee spying programs. Today, neither, of course, as we know, has been a very reliable check on government. We have been discussing Fritz Schwarz's book, A Democracy in the Dark, The Seduction of Government Secrecy. And that does it for our show today. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Kiana Turner and Federico Garcia are our audio engineers. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Your subscription sustains the TV production of Uprising and also gives you exclusive access to all our videos. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com, and our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.